watching Morning at NTV.
Well, good morning and welcome back to Morning at NTV. My name is Idris Matusegawa, and we are still going on with more topics that interest you and have an effect on your life. Now, right now, we are going into a discussion that is very, very important for the economy of Uganda. Tomorrow, on Tuesday, the oil companies will officially sign the final investment decision on their investment into Uganda's oil and gas sector. To speak to us is Mr. James Muhindo, the coordinator of the Civil Society Coalition on Oil and Gas, and the lawyer Dennis Kakembo, a partner at Crystal Advocates, who has been intimately involved in these negotiations. Gentlemen, you're welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Now, let's get into exactly what Cisco is. And I'll start with you, James. What do you do as Cisco?
Cisco is a coalition of over 60 NGOs which work on oil and gas issues, and our focus since establishment in 2008 has been to identify ways in which we can support or advise government on how best to run the oil and gas sector. Our interests are in 4 areas: legal, policy, and governance, where we focus on making sure that we review all laws and policies that government comes up with and share a citizen's perspective of these laws. And most recently were the East African Crude Oil Pipeline Bill, which was brought to Parliament, and the Public Finance Management Act, which were being amended to make room for these oil contracts. So under that strand, we advise in respect to legal, policy, and governance. We also have an environment and other natural resources thematic group, which focuses on ensuring that the environment and nature are not adversely impacted by oil developments. And in this, we work a lot with oil companies, supporting their work to develop environment and social impact assessments, which we review, and we also offer alternative voices to say, while you're planning to mitigate this impact like this, it's better mitigated this way. And then we also have a revenue thematic group which focuses on seeing how much money have we gotten. I know many Ugandans out there may think we've not yet gotten money from the oil and gas sector since we've not started producing, but money has been coming through since 2006 through taxes, signature bonuses, and other revenue streams. So our thematic group keeps track of how this money is received, where it's deposited, how it's withdrawn from the petroleum fund, and how it is spent, to make sure that every time that is done in a manner that is inconsistent with the Public Finance Management Act, we call government out and remind them to stick to what we've committed to. And the final one is the human rights and oil justice, where we advocate for communities that are impacted by oil. And I'm sure you've on a number of occasions heard civil society speaking up about the plight of communities affected by oil. So in a nutshell, that's what Cisco does.
Dennis, I'll come to you. As James has spotted, that their mandate is to make sure there is inclusion in how much we are earning from the oil since 2006. It's been 15 years, and not so much information has come out per the money that we've earned as a country and where it is going. But now we are hearing tomorrow the final investment decision is going to be signed and officially disseminated. What is that, if you can kindly define it for us?
Thank you, Idris. Now, in terms of oil and gas industry, the final investment decision is an irreversible commitment by the oil and gas companies to move ahead investing in the oil and gas sector. So what this means is that whatever happens after tomorrow, Uganda's project is going to move ahead. You're going to see construction of the production facilities. The East African Crude Oil Pipeline is going to be built, and I mean, within 3 to 4 years, Uganda's first oil will flow. But of course, what is exciting the public is looking at Uganda joining the League of Oil Producers. Of course, that will happen in 4 years. But even before we go to oil production, the investment which is going to be incurred in the 4 years before oil production comes out of the ground is monumental. Over $15 billion is going to be spent. Now that is the single largest capital spend which has been incurred on an investment in Uganda. Before this oil project, I think the Karuma Dam, which cost about $2.2 billion, was the most expensive. But here you are, you now have a project that is going to cost almost 8 times more than what has been spent. And that is the largest single investment in Uganda. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the economic figures and numbers, which have been put before us, it's expected that in about 3 to 4 years, Uganda's GDP would have increased by over 22%, I think from about $30 billion that we have presently to about $42 billion in 4 years' time. But then also bringing it closer to where the locals can understand, in terms of employment, the direct employment opportunities that are projected to accrue from the sector is going to be in excess of 100,000 jobs. Those are the direct jobs. But of course, as the economy keeps growing, there will also be indirect jobs that will be created. But even more to that, in terms of local spend, about 40% of the revenues, rather of the capital which is going to be incurred in developing Uganda's oil and gas sector, is going to be spent locally. And as we'll probably get a chance to speak about this later, there's what we call national content. National content is the initiatives that is intended to ensure that locals participate in the oil and gas sector so that the multiplier effect is felt more. So a minimum of $6 billion is going to be spent locally. And already the law ring fences about 16 opportunities that are available to local players for them to participate. So I would expect that from tomorrow up to the next 4 years, there are going to be lots of business opportunities. But even from a macro level, I mean, when oil production commences, there will be a new revenue stream that will be opened up for the government. But even before that new revenue stream opens up for the government, look at it in terms of the taxes that the government is going to collect. I mean, my colleague James has already hinted about the fiscal and revenue side of it. Already expatriates are coming in, and when expatriates come into a country, they are paid big monies. And so even before government can collect the profit taxes, the income tax, the pay as you earn, that is the income that is paid on tax or on salaries, government is going to be able to collect that. These expatriates are going to be sleeping in apartments or accommodation that is provided by Ugandans. These expatriates are going to be eat foods that are provided by Ugandans. They are going to be moved around in cars that are leased from Ugandans. So it will be a multiplier impact. I mean, you're collecting pay as you earn from the oil companies, but even those service providers are going to be forced to employ more people to whom you'll be paying. And then, of course, as you spend, there's the VAT, the indirect taxes. So government streams of revenues are going to increase. And that is why, from where we've been, if you recall, about 3 years ago, government and oil companies had a big dispute around tax issues. And the issues was largely profit taxes, the revenues that are earned by the oil companies. And then we're telling government, you know what, it's a question of balancing the interests of both the companies and the government. You can forego some of the profit taxes so as not to compromise the multiplier impact. I mean, if you delay the project, it actually means that people cannot be employed. Yet pay as you earn, when you look at the national parts of URA, it contributes the great amount of revenues and indirect taxes, tax revenues. So tomorrow is a monumental day. It's a historical day, and everyone should be proud of this feat.
Thank you for that information. And for us, the layman who might not understand exactly what's going on, I'll come to you, James. What is being signed tomorrow? Is it in tandem of those things that all the numbers and all the opportunities Dennis is talking about?
Yes, like Dennis said, the final investment decision is a decision arrived at by private companies after they've evaluated all their options and decided that come what may, we are going to invest in the country. So while we've been having oil operations and we have Total and Sinok doing whatever they were doing in the Albertine Graben, it was not concrete. They were not committed. There was still room for them to say, looking at the investment climate, we are leaving. But with the event that's happening tomorrow, which is why Dennis rightfully calls it monumental, they are saying come rain, come sunshine, we shall have to produce Uganda's oil. And that's why the Ministry of Energy, actually since 2015, this final investment decision has been always just on the horizon, with the minister saying next year, next year, next year. And about 5 years into that waiting, we have this being made, because government gave oil companies production licenses in 2015 and 2016. So from that point, it was up to them to say, okay, now that you've played your part as government, on top of signing the agreements that have been signed in the last 3 years, let's make a final investment decision. So it's a very, very important decision. But one thing I would like to add, that for an ordinary Ugandan, as you mentioned, all this can be rosy, but if it doesn't translate into a better life for someone in Kasese, where I come from, or someone in Arua or Karamoja, it will remain nothing but statistics on paper, which is what one of the problems as civil society which we find with economists, where you find GDP can grow, but if, for example, the revenues from oil do not result into less tax burden on the Ugandans who are being taxed everywhere they go, then it will not translate into that opportunity that we are looking at. If, like Dennis said, we don't make sure that Ugandans participate, there is a risk of, for example, the vehicles being hired, as Dennis mentioned, being provided for by international companies. But fortunately, the Ministry of Energy and other actors ring-fenced certain opportunities or provision of certain services to be exclusive to Ugandans, and we think this is going to be an opportunity to make sure that of this about 15 billion, Ugandans take a fair share of that in terms of providing services to the sector. So what
are some of those services that have been ring-fenced for Ugandans to actually provide them? Because so many times we see investors coming into the country, they are given tax holidays, they are given the freedom to operate the way they want to, and at the end of the day, Ugandans, we don't really gain from their investment. It's them coming in, making the money, taking it back to where they're coming from. So what are some of these services that?
Some of the services include catering, I think hotel, transportation. There is, among other things, there are a number of them which have been identified, and in order to make sure this is enforced, the Petroleum Authority established a service provider database where all Ugandan companies that are able to provide these identified services can be registered, so that every time oil companies are interested in those services, they are told, do not source from outside Uganda. There are these companies here which are registered that are in position to provide that service.
And what are some of the services that are being outsourced?
Most of the services are relating to engineering works and construction. For example, in the fields, the companies which are going to construct the central processing facility, those sophisticated oil and gas services that may not be sourced locally.
Okay, so James, why I ask this is that when you talk about the services that have been ring-fenced for Ugandans, you talk about transportation and catering. That might not really be key components to oil production for the next 20, 50 years. So is there something being done to make sure that even if these outsourced engineering complex services are being outsourced, are Ugandans being trained or being involved that in the next 5 years, because since 2006, it's been 15 years plus. So are Ugandans being trained to actually be involved in this, or is it going to be a case of what we've been seeing before? Investors come in, they use their own people, and we are at the bottom of the chain.
As a civil society, actually, one of the things we commend government for is training Ugandans to be able to participate in the sector, even at the more technical level, where, and the president has said this over and over again, that since the 90s, having identified the sector as crucial, he started sending out Ugandans to go and learn oil and gas. And right now, the Ministry of Energy, Petroleum Authority is full of experts in oil-related issues. And we also have training. For example, right now I think Total is also training some Ugandans who are under 29 to be able to participate in the sector. We have local training institutes like Chigumba, which is also training Ugandans to be involved in the more technical aspects of the sector beyond service provision. So efforts are being done, but the oil and gas sector is a very capital intensive and high risk sector that you don't get someone just from school to start working, because you don't risk such an investment in the hands of someone who doesn't have the requisite experience. So given that we are looking at beyond 25 years of oil, I believe maybe in the next 10 or 15 years we shall have Ugandans who are able to play more central roles, and that's what the national content policy provides, that as we go along we have Ugandans occupying more lucrative roles in the sector, having attained the experience over the years. So given that we are starting, there is a limit to how much we can ask of companies in terms of participation, but going forward, maybe in the medium term, we hope that we shall have Ugandans that can play a more active role in terms of the technical aspects of the sector.
Well, I'll come to you, Mr. Dennis Kakembo. You've talked about how tomorrow is monumental. The final investment decision is being signed. Take us through the timeline. It's been 15 years plus, and Ugandans might complain and say, it's been 15 years, why has it taken this long? Just take us through the timeline and why it has taken 15 years for us to come to this.
Okay. I think to fully appreciate Uganda's oil journey, we need to put in context the political economy of the oil and gas sector. It had always been expected that Uganda had oil, but the timing was not favorable for the oil companies to come in and actually undertake the prospecting and exploration. It was in 1997 that a wild-cat company called Heritage Oil came into the country. In 1997, we had ADF rebels in the western part of Uganda. And it's a crazy investor who makes such a decision to come into a country at a time when you have insurgency going on. So what that would mean is that for Uganda to be able to lure that kind of investor, you actually had to give a lot of incentives. And the earlier PSAs which were signed actually had a lot more favorable terms comparable to the newer PSAs, because at that point in time, there were no roads in the western part of the country, there was insurgency, there were bushes, and therefore it was extremely difficult to attract someone to come in. So when Heritage Oil came into the country in 1997, it started doing some works, but not a lot of work was done until 2001. And in 2001, because the oil and gas industry has lots of risks, it is rare that you take it on alone. Usually you have to bring on board other players. So in 2001, two companies came on board. There was Energy Africa, which was a South Africa-based company, and had Man Resources, to join efforts with Heritage Oil. And at that point in time, they started doing a lot more work, acquisition of data, doing the seismic, and eventually in 2004, they started to doing the actual exploration, drilling. So around 2004, another major event, 2425, happened. Tullow Oil picked interest into Uganda when it acquired Energy Africa. And when it acquired Energy Africa, it took over all the rights to explore that it had in Uganda. And together with Heritage Oil and Hadman Resources, they continued with the exploration. And in 2005, some finds were made. But it's in 2006 that commercial thresholds of oil were made. So at the time in 2006, what was happening is that oil prices were rising on the global market. And because of the rising global prices, there's what we call resource nationalism. Countries tend to become harder because you have this resource, so why don't we negotiate harder? We need to get more resources from our oil and gas.
Yeah.
So that is the time when Uganda's oil and gas discoveries were made, at the time of rising resource nationalism. And for that reason, government officials negotiated very hard. And because of the negotiation, especially around tax issues and how would Uganda's oil and gas be developed, would we only have a refinery, would we need to have only a pipeline, it took a bit of time to resolve some of those disputes. And in fact, the delay is largely attributed to the tax disputes and the commercialization options. But then also, it's a time when it was a steep learning curve. Many of the government officials they might have been educated, they had all the knowledge, but they didn't have much deep expertise in terms of negotiating commercial deals with the oil companies. So there was a lot of understandable mistrust. I mean, if an oil company comes and presents a view, you really have to check it out to ensure that it's the best that really happens to you. So we've had a lot of tax disputes. And the tax disputes, fortunately, as time has gone on, it's been understood. When we saw Tallow Oil, Heritage Oil exit, then Sinok and Total come in, the perception at that point in time was that, oh, these guys are already making money. They're selling off our oil. We see other players coming on board, so windfall profits are being made, which actually was not the case. When an industry is novel in the oil and gas industry, you will attract smaller players like Heritage Oil, who will come, de-risk, make the discovery. Now, after they've made a discovery, they do not have the technical and financial expertise to move ahead the sector, because you need $20 billion to develop the resource in Uganda. Heritage Oil does not have that money. So what that means is that the bigger players, once they find out that a discovery has been made in Uganda, they will pick interest. And how they come and participate in Uganda's interest is by acquiring interest in the likes of Heritage Oil or even Tallow Oil. So a lot of the disputes that arose when we saw players come into the country was, I think, the lack of awareness at that point in time that is how the oil and gas sector develops. You begin off by having the smaller players, and then subsequently the bigger players come on board and they help develop the country. But of course, the biggest challenge we had, I mean, regardless of all that, I think it's 2019. When relationships between government and the oil companies dramatically soured. And in fact, after events of 2019, everyone thought that Uganda's oil and gas industry was doomed.
What happened in 2019?
If you recall, in September of 2019, Total, around July, actually, July 2019, there was a transaction that involved Tallow Oil selling off part of their stake to Total and Sinok. The reason why Tallow Oil was selling part of its stake is that they did not have the finances to invest in building the production facilities and the pipeline. So one way of financing that was to sell off part of the stake. But the manner in which the payments were being made, Tallow Oil was only receiving like $100 million and $200 million. And the $700 million, they were not going to receive it in cash. But rather, when this phase that is starting after tomorrow would arrive, instead of Tallow Oil spending that, Total and Sinok would spend on their behalf. So that would be the payment. So government wanted to tax that. And for us, we came out in a very strong way and said that was unwarranted, because you're taxing money that is earmarked for investment. This $700 million, in as much as that is the money that Total and Sinok are going to pay to acquire an interest in Tallow Oil, they are actually going to pay to build a pipeline, they're going to pay to build the production facilities in Kingfisher and Tilenga. So there was a big dispute that took time to resolve. Then another issue that arose also in terms of where would the East African Crude Pipeline Company be set up. Would it be set up in the UK or would it be set up in Uganda? The oil companies had wanted the company holding the pipeline project to be incorporated in the UK. At that point in time, UK had not imposed stringent requirements on financing fossil fuels. So if the company had been set up in the UK, there's what we call the UK Export Credit Agency financing. It would have easily unlocked. But Uganda's fear was that if that company is set up in the UK, Uganda runs a risk of losing taxes because it wouldn't be tax resident in Uganda. So a compromise was reached whereby it was agreed that let the company be established in the UK, but let the place of management be in Uganda. That way, you're still able to have that company within the bracket of being tax resident, and you'd be able to tax it.
Yeah.
And then there were other issues, but more fundamentally, I think an issue which did not come out, which at this point in time we should speak about, is that Uganda's project in 2019 was not meeting the investment hurdles that investors, the shareholders in Total and Sinnock, required for them to call for an investment decision. Usually for an oil and gas project to move to the stage that we are moving at tomorrow, it must have a rate of return of about 15%. By 2019, with the tax regime as it was and how the production sharing agreements looked like, the project was only returning about 11%. And there was no way Total president and CEO could go to the shareholders and tell them, guys, I'm going to Uganda to invest in a project that is only giving a return of 11%.
Yeah.
Then it was the same with Sinnock. So as the result of the breakdown in relationship, there was soul searching. Both the government and the oil companies sobered up, and they did appreciate that the oil and gas industry is about meeting halfway. How do you meet the interests of the government, but also cater for the interests
of the investors?
So that is what happened, and last year, all these projects were sanctioned by Total and Sinnock, and which is a huge sign of confidence in Uganda, because I think last year there were only 3 projects that Total sanctioned. There was one in Angola, there was one in Uganda, and I think there was one in Brazil. Globally, and they were saying Uganda is a good project that is going to add a lot of shareholder value to their investors.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, maybe if I can weigh in a bit on that.
Yes, James.
One of the things that ultimately, especially the 2019 standoff, we eventually settled for far less than we were negotiating for during COVID, because it was sealed at the height of the lockdown in 2020, I think March, April 2020, where what government had refused in August 2019, it accepted almost half what it had rejected. So it was a loss because of that standoff. But what I also wanted to add is that one wouldn't fault government for staging a hard stance in terms of taxes. Besides national content, which is an indirect source of revenue, the 3 major revenue streams that we are looking at here include royalties, our participation stake, which is UNOC being part of the companies that are developing oil, and of course taxes. So it doesn't hurt for government to say, as a country where this operation is being done, my entitlement to tax cannot just be wished away in the interest of the other revenue streams. So for us as civil society, we've continued to commend government for having a tough stance, and both against Heritage and against Talo, the matters that went from the tax appeals tribunal, some of them up to London for arbitration, ultimately were settled in the interest of government, which showed that if we had been weak in terms of pushing for these taxes, these companies were actually going to take what was due to Uganda. So it may not be good for investment, or it might have slowed down investment, but it was ours to have, and I think this sends a message to companies, even as they make the final investment decision tomorrow, that Uganda is not just going to sit back and let you play the way you want in their loan. They are going to ask for what is duly theirs, and we think that is one of the messages we would like to send to government institutions, not to lose sight of what is ours and get carried away by the magnitude of the investment and the fancy numbers, because ultimately our lives have to be changed for the better. Otherwise, other countries, there are both cases which oil and gas becomes a life changer for a country, and there are also cases where you find not just oil, even
Exploitation,
other
basically.
minerals.
Yeah.
Countries get these minerals, and 20, 30 years down the road, the minerals are done, but the country has not improved, or the lives of those people have not changed. So we want government to continue pushing these hard positions to make sure that what, according to the production sharing agreements or any other contracts we've signed, whatever is due to Uganda is gotten.
James, since you've mentioned that the government has to make sure that the country actually gains and we are not simply exploited, and then after 40 years we are left with nothing in our hands. For the past few years, we've been hearing cases of contracts that were signed with investors, international investors, that didn't really bring any return on investment for the country. A case in point, when you look at the airport, what happened with that, then there are so many projects that have been cancelled. We reported that earlier on. What is actually going to happen? Because Dennis has mentioned oil production and a pipeline. What are we producing? What is happening? Because it comes at a time where the layman is looking at petrol stations having oil prices way up high, 5,000, 6,000. So for them, they will simply think, oh, tomorrow the final investment has been signed. So is fuel going to go down? Yeah. Just explain to us exactly what are we going to be producing?
Actually, even the layperson is going to get some of those questions addressed in their interest, because upon making the final investment decision, like my colleague Dennis mentioned, we are going to see 3 or 4 years of putting up the required facilities. These include central processing facilities, a refinery, and a pipeline for the export. So in 4 or 5 years, 3 or 4 years, we are going to have production commence in the Albertine Graben, and this production will be for crude oil. Government plans to export part of that crude oil and sell it as crude oil, but also a portion of that is supposed to go to the refinery and will be converted into petroleum products, including petrol and diesel and other products, which now the consumer would be interested in. So holding all factors constant, we think in 5 or 6 years, Uganda may be producing its own petrol, and we may not have to contend with the situation we had the other week when because of transportation issues, the prices go high. So the plan, according to the National Oil Company, is for us to refine some of the oil and supply it to the local market, and whatever can't be consumed locally of that refined product will be exported. And for this, refined product pipeline is going to be constructed from Hoima up to Mpigi, where the storage terminal will be, which was one of the big debates during that fuel price rise, saying Uganda has no reserve or place to store just in case of this incident. Now we are going to have, as part of the facilities that government is working on, include that reserve, which will be used to supply the local market. So in maybe 5-7 years, the likelihood of us having our own fuel supplied to petrol stations, which may in fact have an impact in terms of the prices at the pump, given that transportation may be cut and other overheads. And also UNOC, the National Oil Company, is interested in participating in downstream components of the sector, including distributing this fuel and also managing, I think, stations, depending on how it will be done. So we think beyond the benefits from Uganda having to get revenue from oil, we may also benefit in terms of getting petroleum products that are locally produced.
Yes. James, you talk about 7 to 4 years, and it sounds very promising, very rosy. And even when I go to your website, your website states that quick facts about Uganda's oil and gas sector: crude reserves, billion barrels, 6+. Then crude reservoirs, 2 billion barrels in production, then barrels per day, 20,000 discoveries. No, 20,000 barrels per day. Then you've discovered 21 plus oil fields. All this sounds really, really promising, but, and I'll come to you, Mr. Kakembo Dennis. For years, we've seen that timelines have been set. Vision this, vision that. We are going to do this in this period. And 10 years down the road, we keep on extending. What are some of the things that have been put in place, or even for tomorrow, that are going to assure a Ugandan that in 4 years, in 7 years, we are actually going to gain as a country?
Okay, thank you so much, Idris. I think before I answer that, I just wanted to add something small to what my colleague James has said.
Yeah.
I think to a Ugandan, their main interest when they hear oil and gas production is the fuel they get at the petrol stations. In fact, the question they'll be asking is, are the prices going to fall down dramatically? Now, as my colleague James has rightly explained, the FID, the final investment decision, which is being made tomorrow, is for facilities that are going to put up the crude oil pipeline, the production facilities to export the crude oil. Now, in terms of having a refinery, of course, when the oil comes out of the ground, it is worthless unless if it is processed and broken down into fuels that can be used by the vehicle. So, at this point in time, a decision on a refinery has not yet been made.
Okay.
But of course, government is in negotiations with Albertine, a Graben Refinery Consortium, to finalize all that. As you might be aware, the president, from the very outset when oil discoveries were made, had wanted to have a refinery exclusively. But along the way, because of the realities that kept coming in, it was inevitable that you could not only have a refinery, but you also needed to have another evacuation stream, because I think in terms of demand, our present demand, if we are to refine all our crude oil to meet the local demand, would be about 60,000 barrels per day. Yet, peak production, I think, is going to be about 230 barrels per day. So you would have an excess of about 170,000 barrels per day, which could not be consumed locally, and it had to be exported. But even more to that, if you're building a pipeline to make the economics work, you're not going to build a very small pipeline. It's got to be a medium pipeline that needs to have a certain amount of crude oil go through it. So that is why the discussion around the crude oil pipeline and the refinery has been quite difficult. But even more to that, the refinery economics, when you look at the big refineries in the world, in India, Middle East, they refine like a minimum of 200,000 barrels of crude oil per day. Uganda's refinery is going to start with about 30,000 barrels per day and then hitting 60,000 barrels per day. So the economies of scale usually tend to lower the costs of production. And that is why some economists felt that because of the small capacity pipeline, rather refinery might have here, the crude oil, the prices of fuel at the pump station may not significantly go down, apart from, of course, the fact that you would net off the transportation costs and probably some of the landing costs in clearing, processing when the fuel is in Eldoret, and then also maybe the taxes, but because of the size. But even more to that, of course, there's what they call the petrochemical industry, which, of course, I think the benefits of it might outweigh even if the fuel prices do not go significantly low. Because in the petrochemical industry, you have fertilizers which are being produced. You have paints, you have the bitumen, which you can use to make the roads. So that way, I think Uganda would benefit a little more. And that is why the president and the government has kept on pushing to see to it, despite all the challenges that have been experienced, to make sure that you have at least a refinery project here so that the petrochemical industry kicks off. Now, getting to your question, why have the timelines kept on slipping? And if the timelines have kept on slipping, what concrete steps are there in place to ensure that this time around it happens, or that Uganda benefits from the oil and gas sector? I would first and foremost like to tell you that Nigeria is only building a refinery. Nigeria has been producing oil, I think, since 1960. They are only building a refinery today. Nigeria has been producing crude oil since the 1960s, but they only had, I think, about 5 to 7 years ago, a national content law which ensured that a lot of the opportunities were ring-fenced for the locals. Now, Uganda has had the benefit and opportunity of learning from the mistakes which have been committed by other countries, because the oil and gas industry is novel. It being novel, the developed countries know more about how to exploit oil than the developing countries. So it's experience which has enabled. And when you look at some of the laws that have been set up, they are actually learning from the mistakes which have been committed in the past, and it's encouraging that Petroleum Authority of Uganda is enforcing it in the right direction. And I would like to start with national content or local content. How do you make sure that Ugandans or local companies take part in the exploitation of these resources? First and foremost, at the time when the national content laws were being made, there was a debate around whether all the opportunities should only be served or provided by companies that are exclusively owned by Ugandans, or those services and goods should be provided by countries that are established in Uganda. They have been in Uganda for quite a bit of time, and there has been value they've been creating the economy. And I think Uganda struck a very good balance. And Uganda struck that balance, learning from the mistakes that the black economic empowerment policy in South Africa created. Because after apartheid, there was a realization that the coloreds and the blacks had been marginalized. So affirmative action was created, whereby it was required that certain companies needed to have shareholders in the form of blacks. And the inclusion, basically. Yeah, the inclusion. And what happened is that a few blacks in South Africa ended up getting those opportunities, excluding the rest of the people. And that is what informed Uganda's local content policy. Because if you are to ring-fence these opportunities to exclusively Ugandan companies that are owned by Ugandans, there was a likelihood that there could be one connected Ugandan who could be the shareholder in all those companies. So you're ticking the boxes, but the trickle-down impact is actually not felt. So for that reason, what Uganda went for was, there's a concept of a Ugandan company. And the Ugandan company is one which has been established locally, is one which employs at least 70% Ugandans. It uses local available raw materials, and it's also approved by the Petroleum Authority of Uganda. And to put that into better perspective, look at Serena Hotel. Serena Hotel has been in the country, I think, for over 15 years. This hotel is owned by the Aga Khan, who is not a Ugandan. But Aga Khan, when you look at Serena, it employs like 90% Ugandans. It buys the foods that it gives to the guests from Ugandans. The electricity and everything is bought by Ugandans. So if you exclude that company from the opportunities in oil and gas, simply because the owner is not a Ugandan, you're actually locking out Ugandans from taking part in the oil and gas sector. And I think that way, we got it right, the national content, and the Petroleum Authority has been very tough recently on players who are just coming into the country because they've had their opportunities which have been ring-fenced, like security, transportation, crane hire, catering. So they want to come in and just set up in a month and then come try to tick the boxes and then take credit of some of those opportunities. Petroleum Authority is alert. They are not approving those companies. So, and I'm saying that some of those ring-fenced services are actually being awarded to companies which have been here for quite a bit of time, like 15 to 10 years. What are some of these companies? Do we know of them? I wouldn't like to go into the companies, but I think you had asked what the opportunities are. There are 16 opportunities that have been ring-fenced for Ugandan companies. And this includes security, this includes transport, this includes human resource capital services, this includes catering, this includes crane hire, local available construction materials, office supplies, insurance. So these are ring-fenced Ugandan companies. And even more to that, when you look at the policy, as James had hinted on it, the oil and gas industry, because it's a new sector, you realize that we may not have the capacity to participate in the provision of specialized services. But the law gives the minister authority to keep reviewing the progress Ugandans are being made. And progressively, you will see that the opportunities that can be availed by Ugandan companies, the list will keep growing larger because Ugandans will have got the opportunity. And even in terms of employment, for an expatriate to come and work in Uganda's oil and gas sector, you need to have the approval of the Petroleum Authority of Uganda. The Petroleum Authority of Uganda looks at the suitability of that individual, and when the oil companies are putting in the application, the Petroleum Authority of Uganda will ask the petroleum company to show a plan on how they are going to nationalize that job opportunity. So you have to present to them and tell them, you know what, we've recruited Dennis Kakembo, who is understudying this expatriate. So in about 2 to 3 years' time, we expect that this person will take up that job. So when you go back to PAL 3 years from today and you're asking for renewal of that expatriate, most likely the permit will not be renewed unless if you present a very strong case that the person who is being understudied.
Mr. Kakembo, unfortunately we are running out of time, and I'm going to probably ask my producer to keep having you gentlemen every Monday so that we can discuss this very important issue to the Ugandans and keep updating you who's at home on the advances, what is happening in the oil sector, because it's going to play a very, very major big role for the Ugandan economy in the next 20, 50 years. But just a word of conclusion from you gentlemen tomorrow. How can we be part of the event, and can the person who's at home get the information that will be signed off tomorrow?
Yes. Tomorrow, the event, the official event is, of course, invites only, but it's going to be covered by media, which means there's going to be a lot going on in the media. But also, I'm sure the Petroleum Authority, Ministry of Energy, National Oil Company will be sharing on their platforms the information regarding the final investment decision. And maybe as I part, I would like to really, really appreciate and congratulate government for coming to this point, because it's been 6 or 7 years since 2015 with government always waiting for the next year, and the next year has now become tomorrow. Thank you.
Well, tomorrow is a monumental day, and be sure to get informed on what is happening, because the final investment decision is going to be signed off for the oil, for your oil. Well, just stick around. We are going to take a short break. We shall be coming back with more here on NTV.